Viendo dónde está. Soy Stephanie Burgos de Oxfam.
I am Stephanie Burgos of Oxfam, and on behalf of Oxfam, I would like to cordially welcome you to this webinar on averting ethnocide. We're going to have a conversation not only to become more familiar with the situations that indigenous peoples in Latin America are facing in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also we're going to talk about actions needed to protect life and the rights of indigenous peoples, lives and rights of indigenous peoples in the region. We are holding this webinar in the context of marking the International Day of Indigenous Peoples, which was yesterday, August 9th, which this year has come at a critical time, not so much for celebration, but for taking action. Before beginning, I would like to just clarify a couple of things about the technology that we're using. We are broadcasting on Facebook Live, on the Oxfam Colombia page, and also on this Zoom platform. In Zoom, we have simultaneous interpretation into English for our friends who do not speak Spanish. Allow me to just take a moment to make sure that the interpreting is working well.
You should be able to move your cursor on the screen in Zoom to a button that looks like a globe. And when you click on that globe, you should see options of Spanish and English. And by clicking on the English, you should be able to hear the simultaneous translation. You may also want to click on the option to mute original audio if you just want to hear the English. Ahora, antes de introducir a la moderadora, quiero anunciar.
Now, before introducing the moderator, I would note that after the presentations by the panelists, we're going to take the written questions that the participants in Zoom have sent in writing. We ask that you use the Q&A button, which is for questions and answers, to send in your questions, though you can also write comments in the chat, but that would facilitate it if you could send, it would make life easier if you send questions through the Q&A space. I'd now like to introduce the moderator for our webinar, Lisa Herman. She's an independent journalist. She is Danish. She has been living for the last 10 years and working for the last 10 years in South America, in Colombia, in Bolivia, and she now has been living in Ecuador. Her reports have been published in several international media outlets in both English and Spanish. She has written a lot on issues related to indigenous peoples, and during the pandemic, she has published several articles on the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous peoples in the Amazon region. I'm most grateful to Lisa for facilitating this webinar, and I now give you the floor. Thank you. Thank you. Very well. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good night for others as well. Good evening. And thank you for taking the time to be here with us. This webinar is scheduled to last 90 minutes approximately. And before giving the floor to our first panelist, I'm going to make a I'll briefly introduce the four people who we're honored to have with us today. The first panelist is Mr. Francisco Cali. He's UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He is a Cachiquel Maya from Guatemala who has experience in defending the rights of indigenous peoples in Guatemala and at the United Nations and the OAS. And he was founder and member of various indigenous organizations of Guatemala. Our second panelist today is Asier Hernando Malax Echevarria. He is the regional director of Oxfam for Latin America. He has lived in Honduras, Angola, Bolivia, Colombia, and is now residing in Peru. He has worked for more than 15 years with social movements in the region. Of late, he is focused on the transformation of Oxfam to an organization that decidedly fights inequality with a strong commitment to feminist principles. The third panelist will be Silvestra Melania Canales Poma. She is a leader of the Quechua people in the Ayacucho region in Peru. At this time, she is president of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Women of Peru. ONAMYAP is its acronym. She's also coordinator for the South region of the a hemisphere-wide organization of Indigenous women of the Americas, and she is also was elected mayor of the District of Lucanas for 2011 to 2014. Her experience is based on vindicating her identity as well as the struggle for autonomy and full exercise of rights of women and indigenous peoples. She has represented indigenous women in different forums for dialogue with the state, civil society, and others. Our fourth panelist is Deris Paz. She is a Wayu indigenous woman from the department of La Guajira in northeastern Colombia. She is a social worker and a member of the organization Force of Wayu Women. This for the last 14 years. She has participated in different forums for advocacy locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. She has presented the first shadow report of Indigenous women before the CIDAR Committee in Geneva, in Switzerland. She has headed up community organizing processes to defend human rights of the Wayu people. So this is my introduction to the four panelists today, and I would like to begin with our first panelist, Francisco Cali, with a few brief questions. I'd like to ask you, based on your experience and reflecting on what the Oxfam report explains, or aspects that it did not cover, what are the most worrisome situations that Indigenous peoples face in the region? And from your perspective of internationally recognized rights, what do you consider is most at risk with the pandemic? And the last question I would like to ask, what actions do you recommend that governments and societies take to address this reality? I think you have to unmute. Excuse me. Yes, thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction, and I extend greetings to my fellow panelists today. I would like to especially thank Oxfam for this initiative and for the initiative of presenting this document. The questions are quite broad, and to give you a complete answer, I think I would have to take not only the time of this conference, the issues are quite vast. Mainly, I believe that the document presented by Oxfam speaks to us of the impact of the pandemic, which is not the only problem that Indigenous peoples are facing. Together with it are problems, for example, the document notes that this is a lethal problem, it's deadly. But it also says that side by side with the pandemic, there's a list of situations that Indigenous peoples experience day after day as a reality. For example, hunger, extreme poverty, abandonment, exploitation, usurpation, and eviction from or stealing of their lands and territories. I'm sorry, I think I might be speaking quickly because I forgot about the interpretation. These are conditions that Indigenous peoples face day after day, and they're also persecuted because of efforts to defend individual and collective rights. The militarization of their territories or municipalities through states of siege, which, as I see it, emergent or states of emergency rather, which I consider necessary at this time, but these must be temporary measures. No society can live in a permanent state of emergency, and I think I'm going to answer all of your questions simultaneously. So this raises the question of what should or what must the states do? I would also like to say that the COVID-19 pandemic ends up uncovering, removing this veil that has been covering up the reality of the day-to-day reality of Indigenous peoples face, in addition to all that is indicated by Oxfam in its report. The reality is one of abandonment. So at this time, the indigenous peoples have a major opportunity to present that reality and to demand of the states that they put on the governing agenda attention for the needs of indigenous peoples. And the states should also have muster more political will, because in the budgets of all of the states, there are funds to deal with the situation of indigenous peoples. One fundamental obligation of the states is to protect their population. This means not just legal protection, it's also protection, bringing education, bringing health services, bringing well-being to each and every citizen. But as regards indigenous peoples, they must be given individual and collective security. And therein arises the other situation that the states should and must acknowledge. The elements that could contribute to creating a better health services for the population in general. And there's a need to acknowledge the ancestral knowledge and wisdom of indigenous peoples on medicine. I'm not going to get into traditional medicine. From my point of view, that is mistaken. It is an indigenous healthcare system that has pre-existed, and continued despite so much that the states have done against their knowledge. In addition, there's a great need for the states not to criminalize defense of the rights of indigenous peoples. And states are taking advantage of the states of emergency imposed in light of the pandemic to prevent demonstrations, to prevent gatherings. They've issued arrest warrants for those who are defending indigenous people's rights. That is the most mistaken thing that states could be doing, but unfortunately is happening at this time. The persecution of indigenous peoples is happening. I'm not going to name any specific country. We have representatives of some of the states, or not of the states, but of the indigenous peoples of different countries of Latin America who can discuss this reality. So there's several issues. For example, the criminalization of indigenous justice systems by the states. Many states don't recognize the indigenous authorities. So I believe that the indigenous justice system in all Latin American states has saved millions and millions for the states as indigenous populations make use of indigenous justice systems. And I speak of this in monetary terms because that's the only way that the states understand, pointing out economic factors. So there are any number of situations that need to be considered at this time. There are some negative aspects in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the indigenous peoples, because indigenous peoples have suffered disproportionately. And the Oxfam report makes this quite clear. Indeed, the situation is extreme, but this is the reality, which is to say that there are some peoples who are going to be decimated, and there are indeed peoples who can be wiped out completely. I was struck by a report put out by Deutsche Welle last week, taking into account information that was put out by the chair of the Ibero-American Indigenous Peoples Fund. Brazil is one of the countries with the largest number of infected indigenous peoples, followed by Peru, and then Guatemala third. Mexico has the fourth largest indigenous population infected, also many deaths. So I think what is needed here is for the information to arrive with great accuracy, with clear, precise, concise, and clear information, so that the indigenous peoples can understand it And it's all the better if this information arrives in the indigenous languages through communications put out by radio, by television. We must recall that historically the invasion of our territories required that we continue with an oral tradition, because before the invaders came, our peoples, the Quechua, the Maya, the Aztecs, we had very well-developed systems for writing. But this invasion has left us with an oral tradition, and now, unfortunately, there's been a lack of attention in terms of education, and most indigenous peoples are illiterate. We may write, we may read, but we are positive illiterates in that we can read, but without necessarily grasping what the document says. So there are any number of factors. As I say, the Oxfam document is very important. We all should read it. It is a fundamental contribution for the indigenous peoples for creating their own means of controlling and containing the pandemic, mainly in their places of origin, in their territories, which in many states have not been recognized. Of course, the consequences of the pandemic are very serious and destroying indigenous peoples in any state. So it's very important that those peoples who maintain and practice their self-determination and who have control over their territories are the ones who have best controlled and stopped the COVID-19 contagion. I will leave it at this. Lisa, you could stop me at any time. If you don't stop me, I'll just keep talking and talking because I have a lot of information. This, as rapporteur, I put out a study to see what are the consequences of COVID-19 for indigenous peoples. So information, well, I have lots of information in addition to the information which Oxfam has very keenly given us. And I think this is a major contribution to indigenous peoples. Thank you very much. Thank you, Francisco. Yes, you made great use of your 10 minutes. Very interesting. I'd like to summarize a little bit. I think that what you mentioned is very interesting in terms of the risk of criminalization and the risk that for the risk of many indigenous peoples disappearing. But I also found very interesting what you said, that we can see this moment as an opportunity for demanding respect for rights. That is an important lesson, and it's so important to have your point of view. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you later on in this event. Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to our Well, now we're going to have a back and forth with the three remaining panelists, beginning with Asier Hernando Malax Echevarria, who is director for Oxfam in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'd also like to begin with a couple of questions. So, for example, why did Oxfam decide to publish this report on the situation of indigenous peoples and COVID-19? And then, what are the main messages that should be highlighted of your report? Thank you very much for providing this forum. First, I'd like to thank Francisco, Peris, and Melania for joining us in this forum. We're honored to be able to hear you and learn from you. I'd also like to thank those who are joining via Facebook Live and Zoom. I see it's almost 100 people have joined from different countries of Latin America. We have representatives of U.S. legislative offices and others. And it's so good that we can be connected for a while. in this activity, which is so fundamental, and it is fundamental because it is the very indigenous communities who, in recent months, have been suffering from the various issues, particularly the pandemic, and they've been doing so much work. And we at Oxfam have been working together with these communities for decades. And so we wanted to join our effort to the efforts they were already engaged in. We see this as part of our responsibility. From Oxfam, we are very concerned. We think it's necessary to avoid a tragedy. There's indigenous people have been impacted by Ebola, yellow fever, and other diseases that have come from outside. We need to learn from the past so that there's not a disaster today. As Francisco indicated, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. And the situation of indigenous peoples is especially worrisome going back hundreds of years. And we see that the issues facing indigenous peoples are not being resolved. Just to share some data, in the case of Guatemala, they invest much less in indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have half as much access to drinking water as other communities. They suffer much greater discrimination. And so we saw the potential for indigenous communities to be harder hit than the community at large. We also saw that given the economic contraction that has been provoked by the pandemic, governments were going to be tempted to adjust some policies, having to do with spending. And so there is the possibility of encouraging activism in the region. 20% of indigenous territories in the Amazon have either mining or agro-industrial concessions. We see that the pressure is growing on indigenous peoples. This is an issue of great concern for Oxfam. And we wanted to see this as an opportunity, as Francisco said, for some of the historical barriers that indigenous peoples have faced in recent decades. Well, that we can draw attention to these to help overcome them.
Ya estamos cerca de los 5 minutos.
Asier, we're almost at the 5-minute mark. I don't know if you've left something out. Well, if you'd like, I could just focus on the main messages quickly. There are 3, and I'll be brief. First, in the report, we discovered that the hypotheses that were being noted that by the indigenous communities have been borne out. Some indigenous populations are threatened, not all of them, and we think we need to draw attention to that, or to them. We also see that it is indigenous women who are suffering greater discrimination as women, as indigenous persons, and as poor persons. In the case of Peru, There have been 5 oil spills during the pandemic, and so environmental degradation is produced by that. I'll share the data with you a little bit later, but the main message, our hypotheses, with respect to the vulnerable situation of indigenous communities in Latin America are being borne out. Thank you very much, Asier. I would now like to give the floor to our third panelist, Silvestra Melania Canales Poma. I also have a couple of questions. I'd like to know, as Asier mentioned, one of the points in the Oxfam report had to do with how women are being harder hit in this pandemic. And so I'd like to ask you, as a woman leader, from the standpoint of the FIAY, and reflecting on what Francisco and Asier have said, what trends have you seen related to the pandemic that are most worrisome, particularly for women? And a second question, could you comment on differences or similarities that you have seen between the South and the North? That is to say, the North being Central America and Mexico in the region. And could you share some examples? Thank you very much. Special greetings from the National Organization of Indigenous Women of the Andean and Amazon regions of Peru, and also on behalf of the Hemisphere-wide Organization of Indigenous Women of the Americas. Our concerns as Indigenous women, well, I think that we have been saying, and we have been demanding for some time now, actually, of the various governments of the Americas, particularly when we talk about the abandonment by the state and the poverty. They have actually impoverished us by dispossessing us of our ancestral territories. They have left many indigenous communities in this pandemic. You see it even more, without food and without water. Plus, our territories are militarized. They have subjected us to labor exploitation, cheap labor, and particularly the women who have also often been involved in what work in the informal sector. And these major inequalities when it comes to work opportunities, employment opportunities, which we've seen in our countries, in the different countries. And this is a similarity across the hemisphere, across the region. Today, we are seeing this in terms of basic health services. We have seen that health is not a right, even though it's always said that it is a right to education, healthcare, food. But in the pandemic crisis, we have seen that health is not a right, rather it is a privilege. And in the Peruvian case, there have been some journalists and other media workers through the media. They say that really being able to go to a clinic is a privilege. Only those who have money have access to healthcare, and if you don't have money, then you're facing a death sentence. That is more or less what we are experiencing throughout the hemisphere. In addition, when we talk about education, education is no longer a right. Education has also become a privilege. This year, many children, especially indigenous children, are going to miss the school year. This is a major concern we have because we in the indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, we don't have a lot of technology. We're far from it. And these gaps are becoming accentuated, and no doubt in coming years, many of the children and youth will not go back to school. To this, we must add the lack of work. To this, we must add the fear of contagion. To this, we must add that, particularly if we are women, our older daughters who are indigenous help raise their younger siblings while as their mother and father seek work. And all of this is due to structural racism, which has reinforced these inequalities, which are not just a matter of today. This is ever since the Spanish invasion. We indigenous women who are organized have been demanding of the governments during this pandemic differentiated treatment for the indigenous peoples. But they have been deaf to our calls because the situation of indigenous peoples, and particularly indigenous women, well, the data isn't visible. There are no official statistics. As indigenous organizations of the hemisphere, we have been alerting to this catastrophe, sounding a warning. Nonetheless, the governments have not implemented timely measures to stop these acts of ethnocide. And for us indigenous women who suffer discrimination because we are women, because we are indigenous, because we are poor, in addition to this is the extra workload. And we are exposed to more contagion and also exposed to the different forms of violence and also forced to live with our assailants.
Estamos cerca de si puede ir.
I'm sorry, Melania. I don't know if you could start wrapping up. So this aggravates food insecurity because it is we, the women, who day in and day out take care of what the family is going to eat. We prepare food. This is another concern for us as indigenous women. And finally, the economic reactivation policies by the different governments in the different countries in the region, well, different forms of violence have increased to increase extractive activity, as they say. And many times this is done with blood and fire. This is happening in many countries such as Argentina, Chile, with the Mapuches. In Peru, yesterday, 3 people were killed. And also in Colombia. So none of this is to the benefit of indigenous communities. It is to the benefit of large businesses or large companies. And that's really what this publication is saying, which really sets out the whole situation, the document on avoiding ethnocide. Thank you. Thank you very much, Melania. And now I want to give the floor to our 4th panelist, Deris Paz, who is joining us from Colombia. I have a couple of questions for her, but before that, I kind of just want to summarize part of what Melania was saying about how healthcare is now a privilege. It is no longer a right. That seemed to me to be very impactful and very true. So now I want to go now from a regional perspective more to a specific perspective regarding the YU community in Colombia. Deris, based on your experience in La Guajira and reflecting on what the different panelists have said this morning, what are the most important impacts facing the YU community, especially women, as a result of the pandemic? And I also wanted to ask if you consider that there are different problems and experiences facing La Guajira, or is it more similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the region? And I want to know if you could also share some examples of this with us. You just need to turn on your microphone first.
Perfect.
Great. Well, I just want to greet everyone. I just want to refer to our existence on Earth, and today our future depends more than ever on our physical and spiritual relationship with nature, of valuing and establishing a parent-child relationship that can allow for sustainable subsistence for the body and the soul of people and the community. So I want to talk about the different impacts facing us as an indigenous community, and that's the progressive expansion and the contagion of the COVID-19 virus that has aggressively and violently affected us in the Wayuu territory and also other indigenous communities. Today, the risk of physical and cultural extinction is more real than ever. We feel this fear in the territories for the invaluable and irreplaceable losses of our elders who hold wisdom and our authorities and leaders, both Wayuu leaders and from other ethnic groups. The loss of any life is irreplaceable, and for us as indigenous people, the death of our elders, those that hold wisdom, our leaders, it affects our social and collective and organizational, cultural and spiritual processes in a differentiated manner. And we continue with our defense of the territory, both for the Wayuu and other communities. That's why the loss of each leader or authority or woman does not just affect the family or the clan. It affects us all as we are losing wisdom and our cultural heritage that were being contributed to our processes of reivindicating our rights as a community. What's most painful right now is that the government is aware of the ethnocide that could be generated due to the COVID-19 pandemic in the indigenous territories. And as a consequence of the humanitarian crisis that we're living through as some of the most vulnerable populations. For example, in the Department of Guajira, there is a lack of water, and we have a very lacking healthcare system in our department. And this goes hand in hand with state abandonment. If the government had sought out strategies in the midst of the pandemic so that the Wayuu community could enjoy guarantees to water, I think we might have a different outcome. So I say this in the midst of our reflection as children. Our struggle has been made invisible. For example, the presence of the Cerrejón multinational company over the past 3 decades has eliminated hundreds of sources of water. The destruction of the Bruno stream and its course is vital for protecting our ecosystem. This is why the Constitutional Court, in its SU 698 decision in 2017, indicated that the destruction of this stream would put at risk the lives of Wayuu, Afro, and Mestizo communities in the Guajira, as it violates their rights to health, water, and food sovereignty. It is of the utmost importance to return the Bruno Stream to its original course to preserve the dry tropical forest ecosystem, which is at risk of disappearing in Colombia. The destruction of its natural course puts us in critical danger of seeing the extinction of species that live there and the fish that feed our communities. I don't know why we need to bring food into the Guajira when we were capable of producing our own food, our own milk, and different foods that we have grown historically. Today we cannot do this. It is vital to return the Bruno Stream to its natural course. The increase of respiratory illnesses due to the contamination resulting from carbon dust that is transported by train throughout our territory has made us more vulnerable vis-a-vis the pandemic. People are not able to have robust immune systems to deal with the COVID-19 virus. And of course, this pandemic is going to be fatal for someone with these pre-existing conditions. If you could start wrapping up. And recent government decrees have made us invisible. They don't guarantee our right to preserve our lives, especially when we're facing respiratory illnesses. Well, we don't have potable water. We don't even receive the muddy water that is available. And this is why I want to applaud the participation of national and international organizations that have extended their hand to us and are fulfilling the obligation that corresponds to the government to help indigenous communities. One of the impacts of the pandemic that we are suffering are the levels of domestic violence during the pandemic. Another panelist mentioned this, economic violence that affects us. And we are also facing economic and labor issues due to the racism that we have historically faced. And also spiritual and cultural attacks. We don't feel like we are able to go out onto the street to seek food for our children. Men dedicate themselves to different work. Women are dedicated to artisan work, and we are forced to go out into the market every day to ensure that we can obtain food for our children. And our children aren't able to go to school where they were guaranteed at least one meal per day. And I was speaking to someone recently who said that we are being affected in different ways. We are seeing how the dreams of adolescents are being stifled because they cannot go to school. And we are also being affected in terms of sexual and reproductive rights. While today our healthcare system is inefficient and ineffective, And if someone is infected with COVID, it's almost impossible to go to a health service center. And if I'm someone that does not speak Spanish, I have no one to guide me through the process and to explain to me what measures can be taken. Many women that I have seen don't even have access to contraceptives. So this type of violence affects women throughout Colombia. Thank you very much. I think the challenges facing us are serious, such as poverty and a lack of access to services. Hello? If you could please start wrapping up that part of the presentation, and then we will have a second round as well. Just to wrap up, I think globally, women in all indigenous communities, we have all suffered a lot of discrimination just for being women or indigenous or poor. So we need to be more visible in these struggles. So I will just leave it there so we can talk about other issues. Thank you very much, Dedis. And I just wanted to highlight some of these points. I thought what you said, I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned that they are more affected, or you're more affected as communities when elders die than in my country or European countries. It could be a different effect for us, and it might be more difficult for us to understand. What does it mean to lose the life of an elder for an indigenous community? Well, not just for the family, but also for the cultural heritage of the community. I think it's very important to include that perspective. And also what you mentioned about how much it hurts to be abandoned by the state. I thought that was an important point. And you kind of ended where Asier left off, talking about the triple discrimination facing women. And we also see this in the Oxfam report. And I wanted to get back to Asier for a second round of our conversation. And I also wanted to mention to all of our participants on Facebook and on Zoom, your questions are welcome. If you have any questions, you can send them in writing, and we can get to those after our second round of conversation. So we're going to start with Asier. I wanted to ask, in the current and difficult context of the pandemic, what solutions are we seeing? What are the most important needs? And what actions are needed? I want to highlight some of the most important issues that both Melania and Dedis mentioned. The first is that indigenous communities have been impoverished by mining and drilling for oil. They've been impoverished by an absence of the state. They've been impoverished by the dispossession of their lands. I think it's also important what they mentioned about healthcare. It's not a privilege. Healthcare is a right. And it's very important to highlight that message. Also, the impact of the pandemic on education. Many of our children will stop attending school permanently, and we can lose practically an entire generation. And also, what Deris mentioned, all of the different forms of violence that they're facing and how they're tied to their ancestral. More than 70% of women who work in Latin America work in the informal sector. They almost all of the work to care for family members is done by women, and many also work in the informal sector. Deris pointed that out, and I think it's very important. There is some more data that I wanted to discuss that are related to solutions. First, the impact on the over 400 indigenous communities. More than half, 212, have been impacted by the coronavirus. Over the past 2 months, deaths have increased 11-fold among indigenous communities, which is twice the increase in deaths for the general population. And that has to do with issues related to healthcare that Melania mentioned. In Peru, 1/3 of COVID deaths in Amazonian departments are indigenous persons. And so it is important to take immediate measures to avoid more death. What would some solutions be? We have to distinguish between immediate term and medium term solutions. We have touched on some of the historical barriers facing indigenous communities. In the short term, we see that indigenous communities have taken the initiative in the face of inaction by the government to protect themselves, to isolate themselves, but also in terms of responses. We think that their authority needs to be respected, and the quarantine cordons that they have established must be respected. And there have been people entering their territories, which has affected contagion. We need to coordinate. We need to have the state coordinating with indigenous authorities regarding responses to COVID. We must also make sure that they are supplied with emergency personal protective equipment. They must also be given access to health care in accordance with their own cultures. In the medium term, we hope to see measures implemented to address the economic and social effects of the pandemic on indigenous communities. Many indigenous communities do not have access to water, and we must provide some sort of stimulus for small-scale agriculture.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Asier. I think what you mentioned about the double, how the mortality rate is double for indigenous communities vis-a-vis the general population, and also what you mentioned regarding the different measures. For example, the short-term measures, how we must respect the measures being taken by indigenous communities themselves. For example, self-isolation and different protocols that indigenous communities are implementing. So I want to get back to Melania now. Melania Canales, I would like to ask you the same question. Given the current context of the pandemic, what solutions already exist and what are the most needed actions from your perspective? Well, thank you. And I don't think we ever imagined we would be living through this crisis, through this pandemic that we're living through. It's a very difficult situation that we are living through. Nevertheless, once we, the indigenous communities, well, the first thing we did was close the borders to different communities. And one of the interesting things that we have seen is the revitalization of our ancestral medicines, the use of our ancestral medicines. This has increased during these difficult times. However, mining and other extractive industries have continued and have contributed to infecting our communities. They have not stopped. So we are asking governments to respect our autonomy. If we have closed our own borders, why do they insist on having folks come through that are going to infect us? And this is what communities have said. In some countries, such as Peru or Colombia, they want to impose virtual consultations in order to implement their extractive activities. And this is a serious concern for us. Governments should not be taking advantage of this crisis, of this pandemic, to carry out these kind of consultations with indigenous communities, which are not culturally adequate. And we don't have the appropriate technologies to do that. So we are asking different international agencies and organizations and governments, well, they need to stop dispossessing us of our lands. For indigenous communities, the territory is how indigenous communities subsist and live. It's our subsistence. Our territory is our very life. We are already facing the injustice of not having health care for everyone. There's no health care free of charge. So dispossessing us of our lands, and we don't have any legal security when it comes to our land, that is ethnocide. Because without our territories, indigenous communities will disappear. We will disappear. And I will say it again, because that is our very life. We developed ourselves in our own territories. And so we tell governments to not impose upon us a different sort of development, the way they're thinking about development. And in many ways, it's violent and it's criminal, but nevertheless, they continue imposing this dispossession. We demand autonomy, self-determination, food sovereignty, and also the right to live a life free from violence. Because in all of the different countries, given this situation, there is violence. motivated by governments. So we are concerned about that, and we want a life free from life. This is what we demand of governments. That means that they let us alone in our own territories. We, indigenous communities, existed before states. We existed before Peru or Chile or Argentina or Colombia or Panama or any other state existed. We are the descendants of communities, and our inheritance is the territories, and they are dispossessing us from these territories in the name of development. Rather, governments need to guarantee our right to health, to education, to food. We ask governments enough with policies that are regressive when it comes to collective rights.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Melania. Muy importante.
Thank you very much, Melania.
Sobre las diferentes actividades extractivas.
What you mentioned on the different extractive activities is so important. And you also mentioned that you see the governments are taking advantage of this situation. For example, as you was mentioned in the initial presentation, the use of technologies has and not paying attention to spiritual life. Well, this has also translated into lack of access, say, to education. Also, highlighting the importance of territory for indigenous peoples and the importance of the right to decide what activities will or will not be carried out in the territories of the indigenous peoples. Thank you very much, Melania. I would now like to give the floor to Denis Paz from La Guajira with the same question. In the current context of the pandemic, what solution do you see, and what are the most deeply felt needs or the actions that are most needed? And for Denis, and please remember you've got to unmute. Thank you. I'd like to begin by telling you what are the solutions the government has provided, but there's not much to say in this regard. For example, the Wayuu people, one of the solutions that we have wanted to come up with so that the pandemic not continue to spread, and so that we persons, or we women, not have to suffer this famine, is the barter system. Communities are trading crafts for food, for rice, as a strategy for mitigating this famine. In addition, community partnerships have been created among artisans in order to market their goods internationally. This has been done with some organizations. We have been using traditional midwives out of fear of going to a hospital because we might suffer discrimination there, or there simply might not be a bed for childbirth. So we've been working with midwives and developing close relationships in that regard, also using traditional plants when we feel that in one way or another we have a sore throat or something, some other symptom of this virus or other kinds of illnesses. The use of communication networks in order to provide information in our own language and in formats that are accessible, culturally appropriate messaging, for example, about what is COVID? How should I take care of myself in the face of COVID? Why is it that this pandemic came about? We've been doing this in the YU language so as to help the most remote communities, many of which don't even speak Spanish, to be able to get the information. I think that we have been strong in terms of getting out the information of what is COVID-19 and how it is that as indigenous communities, it's easier for us to get the contagion, considering that our culture does not call on us to maintain distance, but rather to join together and come together in times that are so difficult and with such great challenges as is the current situation presented by COVID-19. Providing more guidance to the communities in their own languages. Some community leaders have taken these initiatives, and these have been some of the strategies or solutions that we have come up with. And in terms of needs, I want to mention the differential healthcare system. And we think that timely assistance from the government on humanitarian matters and health matters is absolutely necessary. These are priorities for the communities. We need to have a space where patients can recover. There need to be transfers, appropriate transfers with strict attention to health protocols, and also providing basic inputs like drinking water, soap, and sanitizer, and so forth, other things that make it possible to diminish the spread of the disease by improving hygiene. We need to have timely tests because it so happens that there's a test and you don't even have the results 2 weeks or a month later. That doesn't help us to take measures within our communities. One of the very important measures would be that the government undertake to carry out its obligation to address on an emergency basis the health needs of indigenous peoples and indigenous women in particular, so as to somehow mitigate these needs. At least that should be taken into account, because we're talking about the large-scale famine that is resulting, but since we don't see any of this coming, it has been fatal, the absence of the state. We have even seen abandonment by the local governments in the Department of La Guajira. Today, we see how there's been an uptake in the number of persons sick and who have been dying in YU communities throughout the Guajira. So as to not go on much longer, I think I have spelled out some of the urgent needs that we have asked the government to address and some of what we as the YU people see as solutions.
Muchas gracias, Deris.
Thank you very much, Deris. Also, I found it interesting how at the outset you mentioned how you are going back to certain traditions, such as barter, and also you've outlined what actions the government should take for the need to guarantee access for prevention in terms of getting tests and results, and that they be in the language of the peoples and respecting their cultures. So thank you very much for outlining the whole point on territory. We're now going to have one more round for the three panelists. I have some questions for each of you, and I'd also like to ask if you have any concluding comments for this webinar? That's what we're going to do in this next round. Beginning with Asier, I have here a first question, which is the struggle to overcome economic inequalities. Can this be a way to strengthen indigenous peoples in a context of discrimination, abandonment, and or dysfunction of the state? That's a first one. And then, and this is a question for all three, if the others want to think about their response as well. What can be done to prevent the indigenous territories from being subjected or subjugated by the governments who, taking advantage of the COVID-19, seek to put pressure on indigenous territories in order to go forward with projects such as mining, soy, and so forth, in exchange for support in the form of food and medicines that are essential for survival in this pandemic? And let me see if there's one more question for Asier. How can we ensure that indigenous peoples have access to social protections? What are the obstacles? Considering that many indigenous peoples work in the informal sector of the economy. And so those are the three questions, and at any time you can ask me to remind you. Asier? I want to say something about what Melania said that I thought was right on target. The conquest of 500 years ago is associated with the bringing of many diseases that resulted in so many indigenous peoples being killed. And the bicentennial celebrations in Latin America well, there are the many members of indigenous peoples dying because of lack of attention, because of a failure to invest in healthcare services, a failure to invest in nutrition or social protection. We can't hear you quite so well. Then I'm going to turn off the video. That should improve it. So the first question about economic inequalities, which is so important. Economic inequality is not the only inequality suffered by indigenous peoples. There's also other forms of discrimination, but economic inequality is quite important. About 50% of the indigenous peoples in Latin America have no social protection whatsoever, no health services, no education, and the state does not reach these communities to provide legal protection either. This needs to be resolved, and it is fundamental. We see that in Latin America, resources exist, but the resources that exist are poorly distributed. For example, as regards health in relative terms, in Latin America, the shortcomings need to be resolved, whereas we indicated earlier, investment in indigenous communities is 3 times less. It's only 1/3 of what is invested in other communities, even though they should be the priority so as to be able to avert the ethnocide. We think that social protection is required, and social protection means upholding rights, not privileges. In Latin America, we find that public health for those is really for those who don't have the money to pay for private health services, because there's such a difference in quality. But that should not be the case. There should be a cushion of social protection for healthcare, education, and so on that can guarantee the dignity of all persons in Latin America. And then some may have private insurance, but people's rights must be respected through social protection, as has been indicated. Now, going forward, there will be fewer resources than those available right now. Indeed, given the tax revenue that will not be received as a result of the impact of the pandemic on the public treasuries, well, that will be tantamount to 56% of what the region invests in healthcare, and the number of privileges that cannot be maintained. For example, the wealthier persons need to pay taxes. They practically don't pay any. Those who have extraordinary earnings should also be heavily taxed. We see this in England, in the United States, or Spain, and there must be you can't have a bookstore in Buenos Aires paying more tax than Netflix pays. This is fundamental for guaranteeing the rights of indigenous peoples and the rights of Latin Americans as a whole in light of this crisis.
Muchas gracias, Asier. Bueno, una de las cosas
Thank you very much, Asier. One idea that was repeated, and I think it's worth repeating it again, is how it cannot be that social protection is a privilege and not a right. And this is a point that Melania mentioned. And that's a major concern that we're seeing now, or seeing even more so now. Now, I also have a couple of questions for Melania. One is the indigenous peoples on some occasions are manipulated by representatives who use them for their political purposes, which places them in greater insecurity and a more defenseless situation. How is it possible to generate mechanisms for protection in the face of these interests who put your lives at risk, especially in this pandemic? And then the same question that I asked Asier, which is to say, what can be done to make sure that indigenous territories are not subjugated by governments who take advantage of the COVID-19 crisis, seek to pressure indigenous territories in order to extract resources in exchange for food and medicine to be able to survive in the midst of the pandemic. So this is for Melania.
Bien. Bueno, quisiera de repente decir primeramente.
Well, first, I would like to say that, speaking to the last question, what is to be done so that indigenous lands not be subject to territorial dispossession? For us, it's very important to strengthen collective property rights, which we indigenous peoples have had. That's been our approach historically. Land should not be private property. It should be collective, and our collective properties have been dispossessed. This needs to be respected, and there need to be legal provisions that protect this collective landholding in our territories. Another issue, we have always been saying that governments should strengthen family farming. They should not just take a welfare type approach or paternalistic approach. Rather, the idea is to strengthen the productive activities that the indigenous communities or peoples are already engaged in, such as, for example, family-based agriculture. And the other issue that would be very important is that, well, and this is something we've been promoting, there should be recognition of the rights of Mother Earth, of Mother Nature, because all of our laws recognize the rights of human individuals, but not of Mother Earth, nature, which for us, indigenous women and indigenous peoples, our Mother Earth has life. Many people don't understand this, but this is our cosmovision. And in Latin America, we have thought, and we indigenous peoples think, that Mother Earth is alive, and we cannot destroy her. And it is precisely due to this massive destruction, this exploitation and overexploitation. Well, that is also a reason why these pandemics have come, and many more pandemics will come. And we need to change, we need to avoid this. We also need to recognize the biodiversity of Mother Earth. It is to Mother Earth is here to subsist, not to be exploited or to get rich from. That is another thing that would have to be done. In addition, when it comes to healthcare and education, which are fundamental rights, the government should earmark a budget, as in the case of Peru. Less than 3% is earmarked for healthcare. So that health sector, education sector is totally abandoned. And what the governments have been promoting privatization, and that's why we speak of privilege. These rights to healthcare and education should be absolutely free and universal, and the governments should strengthen that. That is one of the important things. And earmark a budget, we have always said. In Peru, the budget is no more than 6%, and that could certainly be improved upon. Yet the governments rather spend on war, on weapons, on militarizing our peoples, but not so much for ensuring these fundamental rights. And it's not that they manipulate us, but the issue is that there is a system of participation that has been imposed on us indigenous peoples. In Peru, for example, and in many places, in many countries, there's no system for participation as per our mechanisms as indigenous peoples. We don't have that. We have no participation in the Congress, for example. There are 130 members of the Congress, and not a single one of them is an indigenous person. I think it's important to take that into account as well, because the participation of indigenous men and women is it's very important that we take that into account, but it's not being done. Unfortunately, corruption cuts through everything. It cuts through everything. Corruption is institutionalized. It is installed. The governments no longer say anything. They don't even feel ashamed. Some news appears about corruption cases, but there are not any drastic sanctions for the corrupt and for those who corrupt others, because it's those who corrupt behavior and corrupting others, but these must be sanctioned, and they result in a lot of poverty. There are many hospitals whose construction hasn't even been completed. Likewise, schools. That's the other issue. So it's not just a question of talking about corruption. There need to be mechanisms for drastic sanctions, and let whoever fall. Thank you very much, Melania, and I'd also like to give some time for the last two panelists. First, I'll give the floor to Denis, and then at the end to Francisco Cali, who has rejoined us. And what Melania mentioned, which I also think is so important, indicating that it is high time to recognize the rights of Mother Earth and an issue that is receiving a lot of attention in the region, which is corruption, and how that also has a very major impact on indigenous people. Teres, I want to put the same question to you. What can be done to keep the indigenous territories from being subjugated by the governments who, taking advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic, seek to bring pressure to bear on these territories so as to extract resources in exchange for providing some, say, support in the form of food and medicine so that the communities can make it through this pandemic? That's a very complex question. I'm sorry, what did you say? And also, if you could be brief. That's a complex question when we see in the Department of La Guajira, and I mentioned this earlier, there are any number of mega projects extracting our mineral wealth and the governments are looking out for the interests of the mega projects. What is the solution when the government gives its absolute backing to these companies and not to indigenous territories, when we historically have seen not only the privatization of the territories by multinationals and by their projects, but also in the context of the armed conflict? We've been displaced, we've been expelled from our territories. So I would say, what is the strategy? Of course, the strategy would be for them to respect our special rights, the right to prior consultation, where they should go to the indigenous territories. But honestly, I can't find words for it. In our social organizational processes, we've never seen respect for our territorial rights as indigenous peoples. And when we have sought institutional support for these companies to somehow carry out their social responsibility, the response has been no. So it would be a question of looking for local organizations and international organizations to support us in this regard, because we have been working to defend our territories. We've wanted to raise awareness internationally about all of the consequences, including displacement, including losing our water sources. Yet our calls have not been heeded. So I don't really know what the strategy would be. I'm negative in this regard, sorry, but I've just not seen any positive attitude on the part of the governments. Thank you very much, Deris, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I just want to be mindful of the time. I think what you mentioned is very important, but I'll be a little pessimistic. And we could say that the solution would be for the government to respect rights. And I know that sounds very basic. Nonetheless, that's something that we are not seeing. And you note that international organizations can help make this a reality. With that, I would like to wind up by giving the floor to Francisco Pali, the special rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples' Rights of the United Nations. He has come back to the meeting with us, and I would ask him What is the role of organizations like Oxfam and others when it comes to supporting indigenous peoples? That would be the last.
Bueno, yo creo que Oxfam y las otras ONGs.
I think that Oxfam and other NGOs that have been supporting indigenous communities are accompanying the struggles of indigenous communities. I think that Oxfam is one of the organizations that has learned very well over its long history of cooperating with indigenous communities, both in terms of development and strengthening their structures, be they political structures. So I think that NGOs should do that. They should accompany us rather than be the spokespersons of indigenous communities, because the spokespeople are the indigenous communities themselves. Of course, the NGOs could play that role when the indigenous communities don't have the possibility to do so due to political or administrative issues facing indigenous communities. And I have an express request from the indigenous, or when there is an explicit request made by the indigenous communities for NGOs such as Oxfam to serve as spokespersons. I think that up until now, Oxfam has played a very good role. I know other NGOs that have played an important role in developing the accompaniment of indigenous communities, and also the implementation of infrastructure so that indigenous communities can express themselves and mobilize themselves. And they have not, so that they have the opportunity to grow and be their own directors of their economic and social and political life of their communities. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for coming back to join us and for being brief, because we are reaching the end of this webinar, and I just wanted to draw some brief conclusions. Although we have approached this issue from all different levels, from the political or the highest international political levels to the most local levels. Well, I think one of the conclusions that we can look at is how this pandemic impacts or has a greater impact on elders in indigenous communities and for indigenous communities. As was mentioned, losing an elder is not just losing a life for a person or a family, but rather it's a loss for the entire culture in terms of their cultural heritage. So, in certain ways, the pandemic we are facing is something very impactful for indigenous communities. And as the Oxfam report indicates, and as various panelists have indicated, the way that indigenous women are impacted in a triple way, for being indigenous, for being women, and for being poor. And finally, I just want to wrap up. I don't know if this is more positive or if this is a perspective seeking out opportunities. Asier mentioned that, well, there are resources in the region. It's an issue of the way in which they are distributed. So, as you mentioned, Francisco, at the beginning, how this moment could be taken advantage of to demand rights, as Deris also mentioned, although she did mention that perhaps she is pessimistic in this regard, but that could be a solution for governments to respect the rights of indigenous communities. So this moment that we are living through could be a moment where we take advantage to achieve that. So thank you very much to all of the panelists and to all participants who have joined us. Thank you to all panelists for being with us today, and thank you, Lisa, for moderating the discussion. Thank you very much, and farewell.